Imagine this. It's 1914, and Britain controls nearly a quarter of the entire planet. They are, without a doubt, the wealthiest, most powerful empire the world has ever seen. And then, poof. In just 30 years, they're bankrupt, their empire is dissolving, and standing in their place is a nation that hadn't even existed 2 centuries earlier. This is the story of how that happened, how an empire was lost and a new one was won.
I mean, the sheer scale of British power is kind of hard to wrap your head around today. 25% of the Earth's land. That's over 13 million square miles. It meant that 1 out of every 4 people on Earth lived under British rule. The sun, quite literally, never set on their empire. But you know, the real power wasn't just how much of the map they colored pink. It was something much, much deeper.
Because right at the absolute peak of their power, they made a choice. It was a choice that seemed necessary, even noble at the time. But looking back, this single decision was the first domino in a chain reaction. A decision that would, in the end, cost them absolutely everything.
Okay, so let's really dig into this, because to understand how Britain fell, you have to appreciate just how high they were flying. Back in 1914, Britain wasn't just a superpower, it was the axis around which the entire global economy rotated.
So what was holding all this up? Well, it rested on a few key pillars. First, London was the world's bank. Simple as that. The British pound was the go-to global currency. Then there was the Royal Navy, which was governed by something called the two-power standard. And get this, that policy meant their navy had to be bigger than the next 2 largest navies combined. An incredible statement of dominance. And of course, as the first industrial nation, they didn't just make stuff. They built the entire system that moved that stuff around the globe. They were the world's bank, factory, and police force, all rolled into one.
And on the other side of the Atlantic? Well, the United States was a rising power, for sure, but it wasn't even playing in the same league. Not even close. America was a debtor nation. It was borrowing money from Europe. It was largely isolationist, and honestly, compared to the great European powers, pretty weak militarily. The contrast couldn't be more stark. But that was all about to change, because Britain was about to walk right into a trap of its own making.
So when war breaks out in Europe in 1914, Britain's decision to jump in made perfect sense. They had treaties to honor, and Germany was a growing threat. But World War I, this wasn't like other wars. This war was a different beast. It consumed everything, and it came with a price tag that would shatter the very foundations of the British Empire.
Just look at this number. Britain's national debt went from £650 million to over £7.4 billion. Let that sink in. By the end of the war, it was costing them £9 million a day. Their entire economy was re-engineered just to churn out uniforms, ships, and shells. And that led to the real problem.
And here's the real kicker. As Britain poured every last penny into fighting, it was starving the very industries and trade routes that had made it rich in the first place. Their exports collapsed. The global economic machine they had so carefully built was grinding to a halt. And to pay for it all, they had to turn to the only place that still had money, America.
And just like that, the single most important power shift of the 20th century happened. It didn't take place on a battlefield. It was sealed in a loan agreement. For a century, the world had owed money to Britain. Now, Britain owed billions to America. In just a few short years, the fundamental power dynamic of the entire world had completely flipped on its head.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, that was just a wartime thing, right? A blip on the radar. But no, this wasn't a fluke. The years that followed through the Great Depression and into a Second World War would only cement America's new role and make Britain's decline totally irreversible.
A perfect example of this, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. Britain, just financially exhausted, simply couldn't afford its massive navy anymore. So for the first time, they were forced to accept being equals on the seas with the United States. That two-power standard, the ultimate symbol of their global dominance, it was officially dead. Britain was no longer the undisputed master of the seas.
And then came World War II, the final nail in the coffin. Churchill desperately needed American supplies to survive, and Roosevelt delivered with the Lend-Lease Act. But the fine print? Oh, the fine print was brutal. In exchange for weapons, Britain had to hand over its gold reserves, sell off its foreign investments, and give America military bases all around the world. They were literally forced to liquidate centuries of accumulated wealth. By 1945, Britain was completely and utterly bankrupt.
So, by the time the Allied leaders get together at Yalta in 1945, the new hierarchy was undeniable. Roosevelt and Stalin were making the big calls. Churchill was there, sure, but he wasn't driving the conversation anymore. Britain was a junior partner. The reality was crystal clear, and this quote says it all. The baton had been passed.
And this brings us to a really crucial part of the story. America didn't just stumble into power. They didn't just passively inherit Britain's spot. No. They actively and very deliberately designed a new global system with themselves right at the center of it all.
Just look at this playbook. This was basically a roadmap for a new world. At Bretton Woods, step 1, make the US dollar the world's reserve currency, knocking the pound off its perch. Step 2, create the IMF and the World Bank, and, oh, by the way, let's put their headquarters in Washington, D.C. Step 3, the Marshall Plan. Use American cash to rebuild Europe, turning former competitors into customers and loyal allies. And finally, step 4, NATO, a military alliance that made America the ultimate protector of the West. It was brilliant.
And the results? Well, they were absolutely staggering. By 1950, the United States was producing nearly half of the world's entire economic output. Half. And Britain? Less than 7%. The economic transition wasn't just big, it was total. Okay, so the economic power has shifted, the military power has shifted, but if there was any doubt left anywhere in the world about who was really in charge, one final, humiliating episode would make it clear to everyone. This was the moment that proved once and for all who held the real power.
So, in 1956, Britain tried to pull one last old-school imperial power play. They invaded Egypt to take back the Suez Canal. But here's the thing, they didn't consult the Americans. And President Eisenhower was furious. America didn't have to fire a single shot. They just weaponized finance. They started selling off their holdings of the British pound, causing a massive currency crisis. Britain was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. The lesson was learned across the globe. You could no longer act without America's permission. If America said no, the answer was no.
And what this all shows is that America built a fundamentally new kind of empire. It wasn't based on controlling territory directly, not like the British did. It was a system built on military alliances, a global financial structure with the dollar at its heart, and the incredible power of cultural exports like Hollywood movies and Coca-Cola. See, America's goal wasn't to own the world, but to organize it.
So what's the final lesson from this incredible story? Well, Britain's empire didn't fall because it lost a war. In fact, it was on the winning side of both. It fell because winning cost everything. It consumed its wealth instead of creating it. And that leads to a pretty provocative question for us today. As America faces its own challenges, rising debt, new global competitors, will it learn from Britain's story? Or is it destined to make the same mistakes? History tells us one thing for sure. Power never stays still for long.